I'm going to just go ahead and dive in and start explaining that concept, Jonathan.
That's a big part of how Wall Street's been running us into a ditch for the last 30 years.
The debt ceiling is not some sort of macroeconomic concept.
The U.S. isn't really a great place, and it's not really the land of the free.
Get 1,000 people together and let's go lay siege to City Hall.
Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We have a fantastic show for you as always. I want to start by apologizing for my absence over the last month. Unfortunately, we lost my mom about a month ago, and that has led to me not doing shows for a little bit. I've been out of town and dealing with all of that. So I apologize for my absence. On a more positive note, one of my best friends who I've known since second grade got married last weekend, which is why I was out of town then. So I do apologize for the prolonged absence. We will be back to regular weekly shows going forward. I want to start with the regular plugs, you guys, realprogressives.org. For all of our fantastic content, including podcasts and articles, Macro and Cheese on Saturdays, Up and Up on Thursdays, my show on Sundays. Make sure you're not missing any of our fantastic articles that you, again, can find at realprogressives.org. If you'd like to help us out, we are a nonprofit, realprogressives.org/donate to become a member or give us a one-time donation. We very much appreciate any and all support that we can get. And I also wanted to quickly plug, we do some projects with the M for All group. They are organizing a march this July in DC, July 30th, I want to say is the date. And there's also going to be a week of action leading up to it. They are doing a trivia night to try to raise funds for that march and the actions leading up to it. If you'd like to go to that trivia night, you can see the info up on the screen there, and I went ahead and put the link in the description box to buy tickets. So if you'd like to help out the M for All group, please participate in their Medicare for All trivia night on June 8th at 8 Eastern. Tickets, again, you can find via link in the description box there. And I hope that anybody who is interested will make their way out to DC in July. I may be there. No promises just yet, but it's possible that I will be down there in DC. It would be lovely to meet some of you and put our feet on the ground and try to fight for what is obviously a very necessary and overdue policy in Medicare for All. So with the plugs out of the way, we're going to go ahead and start today with a story about the climate crisis, which, as I say every time I cover it, seems to get worse every time I cover it, or seems to, we're crossing more lines of no return or finding out that things are worse than we thought. This is in Common Dreams. It's by Brett Wilkins. Racing at top speed towards global catastrophe, NOAA says CO2 levels highest in human history. We have known about this for half a century and have failed to do anything meaningful about it, said one NOAA researcher. What's it going to take for us to wake up? There is more carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere than at any time in the past 4 million years, as the world's continued dependence on fossil fuels keeps humanity hurtling towards a global catastrophe, officials at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration warned on Friday. NOAA reports its Mauna Loa Atmospheric Baseline Observatory in Hawaii measured CO2 levels averaging 420.99 parts per million in May, an increase of 1.8 parts per million over levels at this time last year, while scientists at the San Diego-based Scripps Institute for Oceanography, which also tracks atmospheric CO2, calculated a monthly average of 420.78. Quote, the science is irrefutable. Humans are altering our climate in ways that our economy and our infrastructure must adapt to, NOAA Administrator Rick Spinrad said in a statement. We can see the impacts of climate change around us every day. The relentless increase of carbon dioxide measured at Mauna Loa is a stark reminder that we need to take urgent, serious steps towards climate resiliency and action, he added. So again, you guys, it's not good news as it pertains to the climate, and I wish that this was getting more attention. I feel like a fucking broken record on this one, but it is absolutely astounding to me that we do not pay more attention to something that literally affects everything. There is nothing that matters if we don't have a habitable planet to live on, you guys. Nothing. I apologize for my voice, and I'm all stuffed up. I got a cold, and so I apologize if I sound weird today. Transition here into another climate story. This is about Biden's and his administration's continuing pushback on any sort of, significant climate action. There is a very creative lawsuit that has made its way through the courts that essentially says that we can't exercise our constitutional rights if we don't have a habitable planet to live on. Seems like a pretty sound argument to me. Now, I am not an attorney, but that sounds like a pretty damn sound argument to me. We're guaranteed certain rights in the Constitution. How are you supposed to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you don't have a habitable planet to live on? That would seem to be kind of a non-starter, would it not? So very creative lawsuit. It has gotten mixed results in the courts, but the courts are taking it more seriously than most legal observers seem to think from the jump. We have a clip here. This is Julia Rock from The Lever, who went on Breaking Points to discuss their coverage of Biden and his administration's continued pushback, if you can believe that, as anyone who's paid the slightest bit of attention obviously can. Their continued pushback against this lawsuit's attempt to basically say that you can't have any constitutional rights without a livable planet. And part of their pushback, you guys, comes because any federal law that helps out big oil or big chemical or big energy or anything will come under scrutiny if this lawsuit were to succeed, because it would essentially then set a precedent that if you're destroying the planet, you are violating everybody's constitutional rights. So it would put into question any sort of policy that contributes to the destruction of the planet. That would mean military actions could be brought to court over constitutional issues. That would mean that any sort of contract or handout or R&D check that's given to Exxon or Chevron or any of the big oil giants would come under question, right? That means responses to things like the BP client leak and all those kinds of things. All of this would suddenly come into legal question. So what the federal government has done for a very long time, which is serve those gigantic corporations and then brag about them creating jobs, that would come under legal scrutiny if this lawsuit were to succeed. And in my view, it's a very creative lawsuit, legal argument here, right? So anyway, this is Julia Rock, who went on Breaking Points to discuss some of the details. We'll come back and discuss.
It is time for our weekly partnership segment with The Lever, and joining us to discuss her latest reporting is Julia Rock, a reporter with that outfit. Great to see you, Julia.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So before we get into this, you guys have announced a new podcast. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen so people know what it is and where to find it. It's called Lever Time, and it is hosted by David Sirota. Julia, just give us a little bit of a taste of what the podcast will include.
Yeah, I mean, everything from politics to culture. We've sort of framed it as the oppositional podcast to Pod Save America. So listen to that. It'll be basically covering the same issues, but in sort of an opposite direction.
Gotcha. So if you hate the Pod Save Bros, watch this podcast instead. All right, let's get to your reporting. This is the reason why we are so supportive of what you guys do there, because you're always breaking important stories that are getting undercovered or completely ignored by the media. This latest one is a perfect example. Go ahead and put it up on the screen there, guys. You report Biden is preparing to crush a historic climate change lawsuit. A vital effort to establish a legal right to a living planet could soon move forward, but the Biden administration is trying to stop us. Stop it. Give us the backstory here, Julia.
Yeah, so this is a lawsuit that was filed back in 2015 when Obama was president, and the lawsuit is really ambitious. It's seeking to establish a constitutional right to a livable planet. And, you know, the Obama administration and then especially the Trump administration fought tooth and nail to make sure this lawsuit never got a trial. What the plaintiffs want is a trial. So there's sort of a big public discussion of whether there should be a constitutional right to a livable planet. And now that Biden's in office, I think the youth plaintiffs who had filed the suit initially really hoped that there would be sort of a different approach from the Trump administration, and that has not been the case. Biden didn't really come to the table in settlement talks, and now his Justice Department is threatening that if the case gets a ruling to move ahead to a trial, they'll do everything they can to block it.
This seems like kind of a long shot approach, the idea of grounding in the constitutional right to a livable planet, but they have actually gotten some traction in the court system thus far. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so it certainly is a long shot approach. I don't want to downplay that. But the lawsuit, I think, has seen more success maybe than initially expected, and sort of more than legal observers would have expected. So one of the really big moments for the lawsuit was back in 2016 when a federal judge in Oregon declared, yeah, I have no question that there is a constitutional right to a livable planet. The case was then dismissed in 2020 by a federal circuit court, but even sort of in discussions about the case, the judges didn't question the merits of the claim. They dismissed it on standing grounds, and they sort of made comments to the effect of, well, yes, burning fossil fuels is heating up the planet, and yes, there are sort of questions about whether you could exercise other rights if you aren't living in a livable climate. So I think it has been sort of surprising to observers the extent to which judges have been even open to the types of claims the lawsuit is making. But yeah, especially, that declaration back in 2016 from a federal judge was really the first time any federal judge had even acknowledged that this is a right that might exist.
And so what is the plaintiff's argument specifically about how a right to a livable planet might be derived from our Constitution?
Yeah, so the main part of the argument is rooted in what's known as the public trust doctrine, which dates back to Roman law. It's sort of this old conservative legal principle that sort of the government or the sovereign holds the natural resources of the country in the public trust, and so it can't destroy those resources because those resources sort of belong to the citizens. And what the plaintiff's lawyers will say is, yes, this is an old conservative legal argument we're making, and we're sort of appealing to a conservative bench. The other part of the argument is one that people might be more familiar with, which is this argument that has come up a lot in big constitutional case law, which is that you can't exercise other rights that the Constitution guarantees if you don't first have this thing, and this thing is a livable planet.
And so what would the Biden administration say about why they are opposed to this case moving forward? In what ways would this sort of tie the hands of the administration?
Yeah, so one thing I've seen in a number of cases I've actually reported on where, the Justice Department is opposing something that would be good for a lot of people is they're saying basically we can't do this. Like this is sort of untenable for us. And in this case, if the plaintiffs were successful, in the Supreme Court in declaring that this is a constitutional right that does exist, it would allow every new federal law or government policy to be measured, to face the legal test of, is this going to threaten the future of a livable planet? And that would be a really sweeping change in how federal laws are made, because many laws right now and many things the federal government does, of course, expand fossil fuel infrastructure and are contributing to the warming of the planet.
Yeah, well, it's a very novel and interesting approach to say the least, and also very revealing the way the Biden administration has decided to fight tooth and nail against it. Julia, thank you so much for your analysis and reporting on this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure.
So, it's not necessarily a surprising response from Biden, who obviously ran on climate action to some degree, even though he ran as a centrist and has since turned around and tried to approve more drilling permits and things of this nature throughout his time in office, really taking no substantial steps whatsoever to address the climate crisis. He would tell you, well, we rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, and it's they do less than the bare minimum, and then they expect credit. And meanwhile, they are fighting in court efforts to actually take substantial steps towards climate action. So, not a surprising response here, but we're going to get into here shortly Biden's response to his tanking in the polls. And this is yet another example of why, when you run on something and say you're going to do something, and not just that, but you also make the case that you, especially in the primary, you make the case that you should be the nominee because you know how to get things done. You guys remember this was like the core piece of his argument too, right? Yeah, Bernie might be right about a lot of things, but he's not going to get them done. So you should vote for me because I know how to get things done. You guys remember this line of argument, right? Now he's had, almost a year and a half, and he's done fuck all about anything at all. anything. The only positive things, the only tepidly liberal or progressive things that Joe Biden had done lasted a grand total of 1 year before the Democrats allowed it to expire, that being the child tax credit and some small doling out of cash to people in desperate need in the middle of a pandemic. Those things expired, done with, over, and he has refused to replace them or maintain them or anything of the sort, but they want credit. Remember how much credit they wanted for cutting child poverty in half? And then they let that policy expire. So if we're going to give them credit for cutting it in half, shouldn't we also condemn them for then sending those kids right back into fucking poverty? Anyway, this a continuation of that. People are very concerned about the climate, in particular younger generations who are the exact voters that Joe Biden needs, and he refuses to fucking act. And then he turns around and wonders, why are my numbers so low? I don't understand. And in this case, it's actually even worse because it's not just inaction. Often the Democrats engage in just pure inaction. This is actually worse. He's fighting against the thing he ran on. Right? This lawsuit seeks to actually push forth some action to combat this crisis. And Joe Biden saying, no, I will stand in the way of that lawsuit. Right? We will appeal this in court. We will challenge this. A maintaining of Trump's positions once again. So next time that the Democrats try to sell you on like this, we're the anti-Trump party. No, you're really not. You're really not. You're the anti-Trump party when it's convenient to make social arguments on TV, right? You're the anti-Trump party when it's really easy to sit there and say, well, we support women more than Trump. What do you want, a gold star? Congratulations, right? But anything pertaining to workers' rights, anything pertaining to the climate, anything pertaining to social issues or the social safety net or providing basic services to people like leftists pretty much all want to do, anything about any of that stuff is just cast aside while they want credit for saying, well, but we're not as transphobic as Trump. Don't you want to give us credit, right? Now, again, I don't mean to at all minimize those social issues, which are of desperate importance. I really don't. But you see how their rhetoric, their electoral strategies crumble when you actually apply some context here, where Biden maintains Trump's policies on immigration, on the climate, right, on the justice system. He's giving out more subsidies to police than Donald Trump did, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in this case, it's even worse than inaction. It's action in the wrong direction. Democrats once again disappointing and reneging on promises and then expecting the voters not to fucking notice and acting all shocked when the voters happen to notice that they're not doing any of the things that they ran on. And in many ways, they are simply maintaining Trump's policies and Trump's America. So to kind of pivot into the polling and things of that nature, I wanted to show you guys there's this analogy I keep hearing from centrists mostly about the bus stop, right? Like the voting is taking a bus. It's not supposed to be idealistic. You take the bus that gets you closer. I keep hearing this analogy. So I wanted to show you guys a response I gave to this on Twitter. At Luke Parcher Show, if you'd like to go follow me. But this is, I think, a very important thing to understand, and I think it's something that centrists seem to leave out of their framing of this entire situation and electoral politics in general, okay? So this is Michael Marshall Smith. He tweets out, a vote is not a marriage proposal. It's a bus ticket to where you want to be. If you keep refusing to buy a ticket because it doesn't go all the way to your front door, then you ain't going anywhere, just standing on a street corner in the rain, shouting at the people on buses. So obviously a critique here of leftists who have abandoned the Democratic Party or are less inclined to support the Democratic Party. Okay, and I'm not making judgments here, you guys. I really want to be clear. If you're a leftist and you see one route or the other as being better or worse, I'm not sitting here judging you. I have my own opinions, but I think we fight about this shit far too much for our own good, and I think the powerful want us to fight about this shit, quite frankly. Anyway, my response to this analogy is if you have two options and neither bus takes you anywhere remotely close to where you want to go, should you still get on the bus that takes you slightly closer, or should you lobby the company to offer a bus closer to your destination? Scale very much matters in this analogy, right? So this is the part that they leave out when they use this analogy to describe electoral politics. If I'm 5 miles from my destination and I only have two options, one bus will take me further away, the Republicans. I'm going to end up 8 miles away from my destination if I take the Republican bus. But the Democrat bus takes me somewhere else that's also 5 miles away. That's essentially where we're at, you guys. I mean, I don't want to give a blanket sort of framing on what the Democrats are, but they're essentially stagnation. They're essentially nothing. They're work around the margins at the very best that has very little consequence on the results in our lives, right? So they're stagnation. They're neutral. They're basically nothing at best, as we just covered in the last climate story. So if you take the best, most charitable interpretation of the Democrats, you have a bus that takes you from 5 miles away to a location that's also 5 miles away. So why am I going to sit here and waste my time riding this bus when it's still going to leave me walking the same exact amount of distance, right? Makes no fucking sense at all. It's not to say it's not better than the Republicans. It might be. The Republicans might take me further away. But why the fuck am I going to get on this bus? And this is the part the centrists just fail to realize. They think that analogy can operate without scale. What if I'm 1,000 miles away from my destination and the Democrats get me to 900? What's the point? What I'm going to do is I'm going to look for a plane ticket, or if we're to a shorter scale, I'm going to buy a bike or something, right? I'm going to look for other forms of transportation, which in this analogy to me would be direct action, activism, marching, education, etc., independent media, whatever it might be. The other options that you can use to affect politics to move us closer to our destination, right? Now, of course, this is a very imperfect metaphor, you guys. I want to get that out of the way, too. Like what bus you take really only affects you, whereas politics affect everybody. But I'm responding to and engaging in this metaphor because I keep seeing it from centrists. So it's their imperfect metaphor. I don't want to act like this is actually a good metaphor, because I don't think it is. But the whole point is they leave the scale out of the equation, which is exactly what they're missing in their analysis of electoral politics. Okay. So with that in mind, I want to get to Biden's polling and take a look at how his presidency has gone. We're going to compare it a little bit to Obama's here, approval rating. This is through 538. And you can see here, this is his approval rating from the first day of his presidency. So you see the green taking a pretty precipitous drop and the orange, which is the disapproval, rising pretty steadily. And you see here, it was roughly mid-August where that switch happened and he became a president who was more disapproved of than approved of. Now, part of what's fascinating to me, you guys, obviously that lines up with the only actions he took, right? So in this area here, this is where he was doing the tepidly progressive things. Now, again, not anywhere close to enough to satisfy me, but this was the child tax credit. This was handing out little bits of stimulus during a pandemic, right? And you see the approval is higher. Okay. And this is also, kind of coasting off of the anti-Trump election rhetoric. But what happens as voters realize months in, oh, you're actually not going to do anything. You're going to let all of this expire. That's what happens. You lose your approval. Okay. So there's a graph that kind of neatly describes what progressives have been talking about for the entirety of Biden's presidency. And this one fascinated me, you guys. I want you to look at the Barack Obama one here. So the green is Biden and the gray is Obama's entire presidency. I don't know if you guys can see that very well. I apologize. I don't know how to zoom in. But you can see the green line below Obama's is almost following his trend to a T, right? And we're only, a third of the way through the presidency. So you see he's following that trend pretty much, online with the way Obama was. He just started from a slightly lower spot, okay? The reason I find that notable is that he's basically done the same shit that Obama did, which is to run on hope and change. You guys remember when they were saying when they were saying Biden was FDR for the initial stimulus bill? You guys remember this? So they utilize that rhetoric and they push those narratives, and then they get in office and they do nothing. And you see the rate at which people figure this out seems to be pretty consistent from about a little over a decade ago. So what Obama was dealing with in 2010 is pretty much precisely what Joe Biden is dealing with right now. Let me ask you something. How did those midterms go for the Democrats? Does anybody remember? It was historically bad. Historically bad. They got absolutely mollywopped. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen in November. So anyway, I know that we discussed this ad nauseum, you guys. I know most of my audience probably already understands this stuff, but it's just worth kind of keeping up on and reiterating. Do not allow those narratives to take hold. And we're going to start seeing it, you guys, as we get deeper into campaign season here. What we're going to see is messaging coming from the centrists who've now taken a year and a half off for brunch. Now they're going to come back and shame progressives for daring to have any standards at all. Oh, you won't just vote for someone because they have a D next to their name? Trump is your fault. We're going to hear all of it. The voter shaming, all of it. Okay? And again, you guys, I'm not trying to sit here and tell anybody that I know what's right or wrong. I have my views on power politics. I think the Democrats are largely a useless institution at this point. But there are some people running as Democrats because of how their states operate and their elections function that I think are worth supporting. But that needs to be a case-by-case thing, right? At this point, electoral politics has demonstrated to do very, very little. So we need to pick and choose when it's worth putting energy and resources into and when it is not. Okay? But for me, I'm a kitchen sink guy. If I believe in your candidacy, if you have proven to me that you're actually going to fight and be an outsider and push for progressive policy, I'll vote for you whether you're running as a Democrat or an independent or a green or whatever the fuck. Okay. That's my view. I'm not saying I'm right. I know my audience probably has a range of views on that, whether you want to support the Democratic Party or not. I don't even like that term. Let me just kind of like backtrack on that. It's not about supporting the Democratic Party. We need to take it on a candidate by candidate basis, right? And we need to recognize what electoral politics are good for and what they're not, and how useful they can be. And I think we often overestimate those things. They can be very useful. Campaigns can be great institutions for educating and community building. They really can. You can build community around knocking on doors and talking about these issues, right? In a similar way to the way that unions and labor organizing can be a very useful institution for community building and for education. Okay, all for that stuff, right? Engage in the mutual aid. Use your campaign to help out your community and build the sort of the infrastructure, the base that we're going to need to affect the kind of change that we want. I'm all about that stuff. And if you can do helpful things around the margins when you get elected, and you actually were going to be a leftist and fight the institutions and the establishment, rather, I'm all for it. Do it. I'm not against that, obviously, right? And I don't shame people for putting efforts into that. Okay. But it's also worth pointing out that electoral politics can only get you so far, especially in the environment that we are currently in, right? And I really do think, you guys, I'm not trying to be holier than thou here, okay? I'm really not. I'm far from perfect. I often engage in rhetoric that is less than helpful and things of that nature. But I really hate seeing the left fight each other over this shit so constantly. So constantly. Oh, you support Nina Turner, you're a shill for the Democrats. Oh, you don't support Nina Turner, you're the problem. This kind of back and forth is not helpful at all. Not at all. If you don't want to support any Democrat, period, fine. But don't shame people who are fighting for Nina Turner, and vice versa. We need to find unity on some level and stop getting into these scraps. Because again, you guys, I want you to think for a second. If you are if you're someone who's currently benefiting from the status quo, if you're someone who currently has power and leverage in our society and wealth, what do you want more than anything? You want the group fighting to create a more equitable society to be in shambles, to be disheveled and broken up and fighting each other all the time. What exactly do? We do precisely that, right? So I want to encourage everybody to kind of take a deep breath about this stuff and not turn everybody into an enemy because of slight disagreements on strategy and power politics, all right? I've made my view clear. Perhaps you could accuse me of trying to walk a fence on this. You could, and you might be right, because I'm not taking a firm stance on one side or the other. I think there is value in electoral politics, but I think it's often over-exaggerated. So, I wish that we could see more common ground and stop picking the minuscule disagreements that we have with each other to turn each other into enemies. I hate seeing it, you guys. Really, really hate seeing it. So anyhow, I don't know how I got off on that tangent. The point is, Joe Biden is learning. The Democrats refused to learn from Obama, and now they're learning the same lesson again. And I thought that graph was sort of useful to show that trend and show what happens when you run on hope and change, or run on being the next FDR, or run on I can get things done. I know how Congress operates, and then you do nothing. This is what happens. A precipitous drop in your approval rating and a absolute dumpster fire in November. That's what's going to happen for the Democrats. Okay. So anyhow, got myself worked up on that one. We have another story here from The Lever. This is Matthew Cunningham Cook. Really encourage you guys to follow their outlet. They do fantastic reporting. One of the few outlets that I think does consistently fantastic reporting in what has turned into a pretty pathetic media environment, right? Anyway, this again, Matthew Cunningham Cook. Biden hikes Medicare prices and funnels profits to private insurers. The largest ever Medicare premium increase will pad the pockets of insurance executives who donated millions to the president's election campaign. So again, you guys, Gee, I wonder why his approval is tanking. Gee, I wonder why. You ran on a public option, and now you're turning around and privatizing Medicare. I wonder why your approval ratings might be in the toilet. Last week, the Biden administration quietly reaffirmed its decision to enact the highest Medicare premium hikes in history right before this year's midterm elections. At the same time, President Joe Biden is endorsing a plan to funnel significantly more Medicare money to insurance companies and further privatize the government insurance program for older Americans and those with disabilities. In effect, the higher premium increases will subsidize the large payments to and profits for private insurance corporations. This comes after Biden raked in roughly $47 million from healthcare industry executives during his 2020 campaign. That's also not, he took a lot from Big Pharma too, if I remember correctly. The Biden administration announced on May 27th that due to legal and operational hurdles, Medicare recipients won't see their premiums lowered this year, even though that rate was originally hiked last November, in large part due to the projected costs of paying for a controversial Alzheimer's drug that Medicare now says it generally will not cover. The administration's announcement comes as Biden officials move forward with a jolting 8.5% hike in payments made to private insurers operating Medicare Advantage plans next year. 8.5%, you guys. 8.5%. That's huge, especially when that number is based upon numbers that are already far too high, right? The juxtaposition between dramatically increasing payments to private insurance plans that provide less care for higher costs on the one hand and keeping seniors' premiums artificially inflated on the other underscores the Biden administration's conflicting commitments when it comes to Medicare. On the 2020 campaign trail, Biden pledged as president to continue to defend our nation's commitment to older Americans and people with disabilities through Medicare. But since taking office, Biden has expanded Medicare privatization by launching the involuntary ACO REACH program and through continuing to promote ever-increasing Medicare Advantage enrollment. And he has also raised premiums for Medicare recipients. The result, advocates say, is a situation in which Medicare's sturdiness as an American institution is being steadily chipped away by well-connected corporate interests. Quote, "The privatization effort is reaching a frantic state and Medicare Advantage is going to fail," said Bill Kadarit, apologize if I'm butchering that, president of the American Retirees Education Foundation, due to the fact that the plans must pay profits to investors, unlike traditional Medicare plans. Quote, "The industry is hoping to cover up that failure with taxpayer subsidies that none of the taxpayers understand." Now, of course, as MMT teaches us, the taxpayer subsidies quip is not accurate. Please just call it public dollars. You guys, stop it with the taxpayer rhetoric. It's harmful. Just call it public dollars. I'm not going to give you that rant again because I feel like I give it every fucking week. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go to realprogressives.org and read some of our resources on MMT. But the point here is Biden's, again, not just reneging on a promise, but actually going in the opposite direction, attempting to privatize Medicare when he ran on a public option and enhancing Medicare and Medicaid. Okay. So he wonders why might my approval be low? Gee, dude, I don't know. So tricky to figure out, right? You better go find some PhDs in political science to tell you why doing nothing creates a low approval rating. I mean, my God, it's honestly something else that all of these people who went to Ivy League fucking schools and have their experience in consulting and PR and political science and all of this and statistics and all that, how can they not figure this out, you guys? It is so patently simple. A toddler could see this. A toddler could see that. Oh, you're doing nothing that you told everyone you would do. That's why you're going to lose. We seem to know this previously. You guys remember the Bush senior presidency? He famously said, "I will not raise taxes on any Americans." And then he raised taxes and then he lost. And everyone was like, "Oh, that's why he lost." Because he raised taxes when he said he wouldn't. It's so fucking simple. And yet today we try to make it all convoluted. And, well, there's all these hurdles in my way, like the parliamentarian and Joe Manchin. So, it's insane. It's obvious what's happening here. You've done nothing and you are now paying for it at the polls, right? So anyhow, more reneged promises from Biden, less than surprising, but his response to his approval rating either tells how ignorant he is or how much he just is willing to openly lie to the public. Because if he doesn't realize what is happening right now and he's pretending he doesn't realize what's happening right now, that perhaps is the scenario. But it's either that or ignorance. And either way, it's going to cost Democrats in November. And I think that everybody probably realizes that at this point. To move on to a more positive topic, we are going to do a weekly labor update, as we always do, talking about the ongoing push for labor, for workers, for unionization efforts and strikes and this kind of thing. As usual, the backbone of our coverage will be from More Perfect Union. If you're not following them, at More Perfect US on Twitter, they also have a YouTube channel, More Perfect Union. They do great coverage of these labor issues all around the country in all different industries. We have 3 clips from them here to discuss today. We're going to start with one on Refresco, which is a major beverage company, and their workers' attempts to improve their workplace.
Body Armor, Arizona, hacemos Tropicana, Gatorade.
Lo que nos hizo comenzar a organizarnos es porque estábamos ya cansados de la actitud déspota de los supervisores y de la gerencia.
Why? Why does the employer have so many opportunities to file appeals and to object and to delay here?
Muchos de mis compañeros se sintieron defraudados creyendo que hubo corrupción, que Refresco con su dinero pudo comprar esa decisión.
Yo para llegar a $18 y pico, me demoré 21 años para llegar a ese precio.
El seguro médico que tenemos en Refresco no es bueno. Tiene muchos deductibles altos, los copagos son altos también, la cobertura es pésima y me vi forzado a acudir al mercado de seguros para obtener una mejor póliza.
Es que quieren un cambio, ¿no? Un cambio que realmente beneficie a la clase obrera, que realmente está totalmente olvidada en Refresco.
Que no deberíamos depender del overtime para vivir, sino que debemos de luchar por un salario justo.
Because the company used for them an opportunity, the pandemic, to institute 12-hour shifts, which they had wanted to do for a while.
Realmente el efecto de 12 horas es muy pesado realmente.
Fue a pedirle al gerente en ese momento, al manager de la compañía, que parara para desinfectar, para poder tener un poco más de seguridad en la salud. Y el señor simplemente dijo que no porque éramos esenciales.
And I don't know what else more to tell you. The Homeland Security and the CDC has told us they want us to stay open, and the first thing they tell you to do if you get a fever is let it break, and they suggest you drink Gatorade.
Así nos estuviéramos enfermando todos.
Ellos llegaron a darles clases a la gente sobre qué es una unión.
Porque si ustedes por ciertos meses estuvieron escuchando las maravillas que la unión le pintó, después vengo yo y les digo, hay una ley y funciona de esta manera, alguien va a decir, ahora estoy confundido, ¿quién está diciendo la verdad?
Los veíamos en todos lados, eso fue como un acoso todo ese tiempo de campaña anti-unión.
Que es la única manera que usted se puede salvar, que la mayoría de las personas voten no, es la única manera que se puede salvar de pagarle al sindicato.
Hablaban de que, según ellos, negativas de la unión, que con la unión no se iba a lograr nada, que la compañía no tenía por qué ceder a lo que se estaba tratando o se trata de negociar en un contrato.
Si la unión gana la elección, los sueldos, los beneficios y las condiciones de trabajo de los empleados sigue en ese periodo de paro. ¿Por qué? Porque ahora el que tiene que negociar esos nuevos sueldos y esos nuevos beneficios es la unión.
Since then, the company has spent 9-10 months filing bogus appeals, making frivolous allegations as to why they lost the election. At no point has Refresco alleged union misconduct. They alleged that the National Labor Relations Board agent who was conducting the election opened the voting center up at 6:05 a.m. one day instead of at 6 a.m. When the poll should have opened.
Que en 5 minutos podían votar 32 personas, algo absurdo. En ninguna parte del mundo pueden votar en 5 minutos 32 personas.
Pues sinceramente me sentí defraudada.
There are 40 new workers here in a bargaining unit of 237 people roughly. People have left. You know, a lot of this works to the company's advantage.
Siguen atacando a la unión por donde pueden.
Está parchada totalmente de propaganda, televisores que han aumentado para campañas anti-unión. O sea, estamos pero bombardeados de información en contra de la unión. Información falsa, lógicamente.
Los que habían votado por el no, ahora quieren votar por el sí. Están demasiados animados y no ven la hora que llegue las votaciones de nuevo.
Quiero que tengamos una victoria sobre Refresco porque va a ser una bofetada que le vamos a dar sin mano con esta victoria.
Y así otras compañías de refresco se organicen a tener unión. Ellos no esperaban este golpe que les vamos a dar.
Nosotros sabemos que lo ganamos en buena ley y que vamos a ganar otra vez.
It's so sad that it takes as much perseverance as it does to succeed in unionizing in this country. But as you can see, just like virtually every corporation that faces any labor organizing, they are trying to drag this out as much as possible, filing bogus claims, etc., hoping that the employees fold. I'm reminded of the coal workers at Warrior Met that have been striking for over a year, and the company just keeps dragging it out in legal ways, right? Just trying to frivolously expand the process so that the workers eventually give up. This is why, you guys, it's very important to support the labor movement in ways like just showing community support, mutual aid, these kinds of things. Because when you go on strike or when you try to unionize, the company's going to retaliate, and you need the resources in place to withstand that and continue fighting for you and your coworkers. I'm inspired as always to see a big company, facing this kind of effort. I'm sure that they will win again if they won fair and square last year. And it sounds like, according to the employees, there are even more people that are now on board with the union than there were previously. And we'll just have to see whether the process can continue to drag this thing out or whether this vote will hold up. So, full solidarity with the workers at Refresco. I encourage you all to support those workers in any way that you can. Next video we have here, also more perfect union. This is going into Amazon, and some of you will remember that there was a tornado that hit an Amazon facility, and Amazon had forced their workers to stay at work despite having warning that that was going to happen. A number of workers ended up dying. This is an update on Amazon's culpability for those deaths and their attempt to get out of any sort of accountability or consequences.
November 10th, 2021.
911, where's your emergency? The Amazon warehouse got hit.
Panic 911 calls.
People are trapped in the bathroom. We got hit by a tornado.
From people working in this Amazon warehouse, 6 people who took cover in a bathroom never made it home.
Austin McEwen was one of 6 people killed when that tornado struck the Amazon fulfillment center in southern Illinois last month.
At the time of his death, Austin was 26 years old. He was the son of Alice and Randy McEwen, who have come forward and filed a lawsuit on his behalf. Austin was a former high school and college hockey player. He was beloved in his community. He had a very serious girlfriend that he was ready to propose to, start a life with, have children with. Obviously, Alice and Randy McEwen, the enjoyment of their son throughout the decades, having children, having grandchildren, seeing their grandchildren graduate from school, and all of life's milestones has been taken away from them.
Just a few of the questions investigators are trying to answer. Did Amazon have adequate tornado safety measures in place? And did the company follow federal regulations?
So on the evening of the collapse, a structural safety specialist who also happens to be a professional engineer and structural engineer went to the actual site of the collapse mandated by the government and learned that support columns in the area where the building fell were not properly anchored, some not anchored at all to the ground. He said he was astonished when he saw that the columns were unanchored. It's a grave violation of the International Building Code, and he said he's never seen anything like it. There's no excuse for support columns to not be properly anchored anywhere in the United States, anywhere in the world, but especially in Tornado Alley.
We repeatedly tried to ask Amazon about what happened here and if there are now plans to add shelters in areas prone to tornadoes. The company won't talk to us and maintains the warehouse was safe and met all building codes.
It is very clear that Austin was asked to come back to continue fulfilling his delivery duties. Work should have been suspended that day. Our investigation has revealed that Amazon, as early as the day before December 9th, 2021, had ample notice that a tornado was approaching Edwardsville, Illinois. But most importantly, we've also learned that this facility was not equipped with FEMA safe rooms, FEMA designated refugee shelter areas. And if Amazon knew that it couldn't protect its employees, there was nothing stopping them from telling them around noon or 1 o'clock that day to go home. And you really have to question if profits took precedence over safety.
Jeff Bezos is facing criticism for his handling of this tragedy. His response came almost a full 24 hours after the tornadoes lifted, and as details emerged about the Edwardsville factory collapse on Saturday morning and afternoon, Bezos was championing his latest space tourism launch.
The McEwen family and other families have expressed to us, you have to remember, they lost very important people to them. And they're very curious why Amazon and Jeff Bezos and its founders can shoot themselves off into space, but never took the time to come to Edwardsville to console these families, meet with these families, and help them understand what happened. Very early on after we filed the lawsuit, Amazon's spokesperson denied any wrongdoing, denied any form of negligence, and actually indicated that people were appropriately sheltering.
Alonzo Harris is one of 40 employees who survived. He's a delivery driver, and that day just returned to the warehouse in Edwardsville, Illinois, when a manager redirected him.
Stop your vehicles. There is a storm coming. Seek shelter.
Harris followed coworkers to Amazon's Take Shelter area. He describes it as a windowless hallway. Amazon says it was not designed to be a storm shelter.
We've learned from whistleblowers inside the facility that it was extremely chaotic. People were wondering why they were not permitted to leave. People, now that a lawsuit has been filed and they've learned more about what should have been placed, have contacted our law firm and myself indicating that there was no emergency plan. They were never a part of any sort of evacuation drill, that you were told to go to work, stay at work, and work all through this storm.
Before he died, Amazon worker Larry Virden reportedly texted his girlfriend, "Amazon won't let us leave."
People have communicated that in the culture at Amazon, the moment you step what Amazon would consider out of line, go slightly against an Amazon policy, speak up, ask for an extra break if it's a day that someone's back is hurting more than in a usual day, it's pretty clear that you're at risk of losing your job.
With Amazon scaling up its delivery service in recent years, there are now 700 warehouses like this one across the country. Most rely on contractors employed by other companies. Industry analysts say that allows Amazon to avoid liability for accidents.
Even before this tragedy, Amazon has had a lot of issues with workers, their treatment of workers, and this is just another example. I mean, we hope that this litigation brings justice to the McEwen family and other families that have lost someone. But even at a larger, grander scale, for decades to come, we presume Amazon's going to be in business for many, many more decades. It's time to start treating workers appropriately. I think that's the number one message that the McEwens want to deliver.
More fantastic reporting there. This is totally irrelevant, but to the sports fans out there, did that lawyer remind you of Rob Manfred? Because that's all I was like, that's Rob Manfred. And he is a corporate lawyer, which kind of makes it more ironic. But anyway, fantastic work there. And I'm glad that there is at least an attempt to hold Amazon liable in a legal sense for their mishandling of this whole ordeal. The fact that the building didn't even meet code to start with, and then they still forced employees to shelter there, forced drivers to return there. There was the famous text exchange, which they alluded to there. I'm sure many of you saw back when this happened last fall, that that was between a driver and dispatch essentially made very clear you're going to lose your job if you don't continue delivering. And, you know, this kind of conduct, again, it's hardly surprising, but I think to a lot of people who are not maybe on the left or have not come all the way on labor issues, are unsure about unions, the people that we need to convince, quite frankly, I think are unaware of this kind of misconduct because the media does such a fantastic job of playing stenographer for gigantic corporations and refusing to bring up these kinds of stories. So again, great reporting from More Perfect Union, and shame on Amazon. I hope that this action can lead to some sort of legal accountability. Of course, you guys, it's never enough. People lost their lives. It really wouldn't matter what kind of earnings this lawsuit manages to obtain. That it's not worth. You know, you can't do justice to the situation. You can't actually hold Amazon to the level of accountability that they should be held to for this. But yet another example of corporations putting them and their profits above all else, including the very lives of those who work for them and create those profits. So the More Perfect Union also has other reporting on more efforts to unionize Amazon across the country. I want to say it was in Carolina is the new one. Obviously, Bessemer and Staten Island started this whole thing off, and now another warehouse in Staten Island is making attempts, and now we have apparently a warehouse in Carolina as well. So really encourage you all to go to More Perfect Union's YouTube channel, as well as follow them on Twitter at More Perfect US for all sorts of coverage on this stuff. And we have one more from them. This is about Starbucks. And their ongoing efforts to fight against their employees' attempts to organize. So this, again, More Perfect Union talking about Starbucks.
I definitely think it was targeted retaliation for the whole unionization effort. I had been pretty vocal about my support for the union.
I was the main organizer for my store. I kind of knew, you know, it was something that could happen because I'm putting a target on my back, but I would do it over and over again if I could.
I gave 5.5 years of my life to this company, and for what? To be just tossed aside like this for trying to be proactive? I went into the store a few minutes early by myself, and according to policy, you're not allowed in the store alone. We had 3 of our morning workers call out, so I had to go in early because I had to figure out my plan. I was just trying to do my job to try and get the store open when it's supposed to. They didn't even listen to my manager, who was vouching for me, telling them that I, was a great employee, and they came in and told me they were letting me go.
We had gotten into kind of an argument, and it escalated into that individual yelling at me and my barista very loudly, to the point where a full cafe was silent. He was leaving to go outside, and right as he was about to leave, I'm like, hey, again, just a heads up, I have to leave at 7 today. I can't stay over. And he still walked out. And 7 o'clock rolled around. I waited a couple minutes, and I had made sure this barista was set up and made sure he didn't need anything. There wasn't a line, no customers or anything. When I had tried to bring up, well, the shift supervisor I was working with, it was his shift. He decided to leave. Why is this happening to me and not him? I was told this is about you, not him, and to watch my tone.
In the termination notice, they accused me of violent and threatening behavior, stating that on or around March 11th, I was witnessed saying that I was going to punch our district manager, Sarah Jenkins, in the face, which is ludicrous because I had not seen her in the store myself in months. It was kind of just out of the blue. I had a clean record. I'd never been written up, so I was a good worker, like I knew my stuff.
He sat me down and he said, listen, based on everything that happened on March 4th, we're gonna have to let you go. He then decided to tell me that he really cared about me and was gonna help me through these next few steps in this process, and that really set me off. You just like upended my entire life. This was my livelihood.
This was my assistance with tuition payments. This is my everything. You know, my health care, all of it just gone in one day.
I believe the moment they really kind of targeted me was during a partner development conversation. They asked me what some of my weaknesses were, and I told them that I had difficulty standing up for myself. I kind of think that was the first moment where they were like, we can kind of go for this guy because he's not gonna fight it. I think they purposefully targeted some of the most vulnerable people in the store.
The NLRB has been very helpful. They're going to be dropping the lawsuits against Starbucks for me and a bunch of other of the Starbucks partners throughout the country that have been unjustly fired. So is that a coincidence that a bunch of the union leaders were fired for these things that they never cared about before? I don't think so.
I really think that Starbucks has shown their true colors.
It blows my mind, and just a perfect example, Starbucks releases like a quarterly report to their shareholders, and they were talking about how it might be a little bit lower because they had to pay their lawyers, and they can't afford to pay their lawyers and us. So that's why our hours got cut. Absolutely ridiculous. Your priority should not be paying multi-million-dollar lawyers to fight your employees versus paying your employees.
People like me, model employees who have been unjustly let go, lit the fire for the other partners to say, hey, if these people can get fired for trying to do the right thing, where does that leave us?
More fantastic work, you guys. Really encourage you to follow their work at More Perfect US on Twitter, More Perfect Union on YouTube. Excellent reporting. And shame on Starbucks once again, you guys. The fact that they basically said to their shareholders, yeah, your earnings are going to be a little bit lower this quarter because we had to pay attorneys to union bust. And oh God, these companies love to tell on themselves whenever they're talking to their shareholders, don't they? Stand in firm solidarity with these Starbucks workers, these Amazon workers, these Refresco workers, and all other workers who are organizing across the country or going on strike or walking out or any of it. And I encourage my audience to do the same. I know I say this every labor update, but do whatever you guys can. And little things mean more than you think. If you are a customer of Starbucks, maybe just say while you're getting your drink, hey, community supports you if you want to unionize. We got your back. You know, those little things can really, really make a difference. And I can't remember which reporter it was that was covering the coal strikers. Oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. I can picture her face. Kim something. If someone remembers in the description or in the chat, please fill in the last name for me. But she went on Breaking Point. She's been covering the Warrior Met coal strike for a year. And she was talking to one of the strikers, and he basically said, you wouldn't believe how much it means when people just bring us coffee or pastries or something in the morning while we're standing out on the picket line, right? Little things, you guys, you can demonstrate your support and show people that they are not alone by just doing little things to show community support. So I encourage everybody, you guys, don't cross any picket lines, support workers where you can. And, you know, if there's mutual aid in your area or any way that you can volunteer to support workers in the actions that they're taking against management, I really encourage you to get involved in whatever capacity you possibly can. So we have a story here about the Supreme Court's latest finding, which has the potential to set a pretty devastating precedent. I'm sure a number of you have seen this, but we're going to get into some of these details. This is in The Intercept. It's by Liliana Segura. Supreme Court guts its own precedent to allow Arizona to kill Barry Jones. Embracing the state's claim that innocence isn't enough, the court destroyed a lifeline for people who received poor lawyering at trial. So essentially here, Barry Jones' conviction was overturned by a federal judge because of lack of evidence or faulty evidence. And the Supreme Court has basically said, we don't care if he's innocent. He's going to be put to death by the state anyway. You can see how this has a pretty horrendous precedent involved. Almost 4 years after a federal judge overturned Barry Jones's 1995 conviction, the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated the order directing Arizona to release or retry Jones and reinstated his death sentence. The ruling puts Jones on a path to execution in a state that just restarted its death machinery, despite significant evidence that he is innocent. The 6-3 decision in Shin versus Martinez Ramirez was authored by Justice Clarence Thomas, who wrote that Jones and David Martinez Ramirez, another man on Arizona's death row, should not have been allowed to present new evidence in federal court showing that they had received ineffective assistance of counsel at trial. In Jones's case, the evidence dismantled the state's original theory of the crime, prompting U.S. District Judge Timothy Burgess to vacate his conviction. If not for the failures of Jones's trial attorneys, Burgess wrote in 2018, jurors likely would not have convicted him of any of the crimes with which he was charged and previously convicted. The Supreme Court's May 23rd ruling renders this evidence and Burgess's core findings, which were twice upheld by the Ninth U.S. Circuit's Court of Appeals, moot. The majority agreed with Arizona's contention that under the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, or AEDPA, which sharply limits federal appeals, the hearing in Jones's case should never have taken place. Quote, in our dual sovereign system, federal courts must afford unwavering respect to trials in state court, Thomas wrote. Federal courts lack the competence and authority to relitigate a state's criminal case. The decision is a devastating blow to Jones, who has always insisted on his innocence, but it also slams the courthouse door on countless incarcerated people whose lawyers failed them at trial. The court's decision will leave many people who were convicted in violation of the Sixth Amendment to face incarceration or even execution without any meaningful chance to vindicate their right to counsel. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote in a dissent joined by Justices Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan. So you guys, it's not just, Barry's enough. One person is enough. One innocent or likely innocent person being put to death is enough. But the precedent that this sets, this would disallow many people from going through the appeals process and claiming ineffective counsel, which you have a constitutional right to, in case that was of any question to anybody in the audience. So a very dangerous precedent being set here, and Barry likely to face the consequence. And I just also want to address you guys, even if Barry is guilty, the precedent is still of much more concern to me than letting one guilty man walk. Okay. I believe, and I think that most people believe, that it is much more harmful to have one innocent person in jail than it is to have one guilty person out. Our system should be designed on ensuring that anybody who is going to be punished by the state is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And I don't think that standard is really upheld at all, unfortunately, for a whole myriad of reasons. We could do an entire fucking show on that. But I think there are many issues with that proposition, with the idea that the legal system operates in some formal manner. It doesn't. It just plain doesn't, you guys. There are all sorts of things that impact your outcomes from our legal system. I don't get the same impact or the same outcome as a black person in our legal system. I just don't, right? That's statistically just a fact. It can be an uncomfortable fact, but it's a fact. So this idea that the legal system just applies laws robotically, completely false. And, we need to err on the side of ensuring that anybody who is going to be punished by the state is actually guilty of the crime in question. So if there are any questions about Barry's guilt, and I take it as pretty strong evidence that a federal judge overturned his conviction, that's a pretty strong indication that the evidence presented against Barry at trial was insufficient to meeting that beyond a reasonable doubt standard. And remember, you guys, it's not, when we think about civil law, it's preponderance of the evidence. But when we're talking about criminal law, it is supposed to be beyond a reasonable doubt, right? The Constitution pretty explicitly says we're more comfortable letting some guilty people walk free than we are putting any innocent people away. And yet I think our system operates largely the opposite way. This is a horrendously dangerous precedent to be setting, and I feel for Barry and the thousands and thousands of other people locked up wrongfully. And again, whether they're guilty or not, you guys, I think the standard should truly be beyond a reasonable doubt, and that should be a difficult line to achieve for prosecution, right? quick note on the death penalty. It's obviously barbaric and dystopian and inhumane. But one argument that I rather like on this, I believe it was Kyle Kalinske who I originally heard make this argument, but he basically said, if you believe in the death penalty, then the second the death penalty kills one single innocent person, you got to put the death penalty to death, right? Isn't it kind of a paradox in a sense? We know that many innocent people have been executed by the death penalty. Basic statistics tells us that, right? So doesn't it need to be put to death too? It's obviously barbaric and inhumane. It actually costs more to put people on death row than it does to imprison them for life. And this sick obsession with vengeance that we have in this country is deeply unhealthy, you guys. I understand that there are some difficult questions about certain individuals, right? There are just people that I think we can all agree. I think it's a much smaller, significantly smaller number than are actually incarcerated right now. But there is a small portion of people that, like, none of us want around our loved ones, that people that need fucking help and are going to cause harm if they're allowed to stay in society. That doesn't mean we need to punish them. It means we need to remove them from society. And I think this obsession with punishment sort of taints how we actually go about our legal system and criminal justice and all that stuff. I like the idea that, yes, some people need to be separated. I don't think they need to suffer and live in this hellish condition that our current prisons inflict upon them, right? Anyway, I could go on and on and on and on and on about the justice system, but that is a horrendously dangerous precedent that the Supreme Court appears to have just set, and that could have consequences for all sorts of people who are wrongfully locked up that are already, by the way, fighting against the tide, if you will, right? They're already in a position where they're having to fight against this system that sort of has it out for them. If you're already incarcerated, it's a tough battle to get out. Probably tougher than it should be. So this would make it even more difficult for people who are wrongly incarcerated to appeal their cases. And ineffective counsel, you guys, is also a very serious problem. I just want to note very quickly, I mentioned that the legal system is not formal. So what does that actually mean in terms of a trial by trial, like an individual trial? What does that mean for an individual trial? It basically means whoever has the more talented sophist representing them is going to win. So if you have the more talented attorney and you have any semblance of a case at all, you're probably going to win. And that's not what anybody wants, but that's what the justice system is, which means that ineffective counsel is a very serious problem. And how do you get the most effective counsel? In general, you pay for it. So this is another area where our legal system is obviously classist and pretty brazenly so. Because if you're accused of a crime and you don't have the resources to pay for an attorney, you're left with a public defender. And you guys, very admirable career path. I've met public defenders who are very competent, intelligent lawyers. It doesn't mean that all of them are bad, but public defenders also have, largely, generally speaking, have way too much on their plate to provide the kind of counsel that they would want to provide to each of their clients. So we have a system that's already stacked up against the poor. We have a system that's already stacked up against racial and gender minorities, etc. And then we add to it that the opportunities to appeal based upon ineffective counsel, which is one of the largest causes of wrongful incarceration. Now we're going to limit that too. It's just really, really too bad, you guys. That's a very dangerous precedent that the Supreme Court has just set. And again, we'll keep up on that story, but the justice system seeming to go in the wrong direction under Biden. Again, I'll mention, after he promised to reform it, doesn't seem to be happening at all. As I mentioned earlier in the show, he has increased subsidies for police in response to George Floyd's murder and the wave of protests across the country in support of Black lives. Instead, he's gone the other direction from what he said he would do. So it's not often I say inaction or reneged promises. I use these kinds of terms a lot when describing Biden. Sometimes it's even worse than that. Sometimes it's not neutral, it's reverse. And, you know, this is one of those cases. Obviously, also worth noting for anyone who doesn't already recognize it, Biden has spent his entire career in Congress creating this problem, like being one of the most prominent people to create this problem. The 94 crime bill, he was the chief author of, and he has long advocated for law and order type policies that crack down on impoverished communities and crack down on the Black community, etc. So Biden creates this problem, then runs on promising to fix it, and then he keeps making it worse. So Gee, I wonder why his poll numbers are down, right? Theme of the show. Anyhow, we have another Biden story here. Once again, sort of tangentially related to the justice system. Another area where Biden has fallen far short on his promises is he said that he would undo all of Trump's executive actions on immigration day one. Well, we're about a year and a half into his presidency, and there are still many that he has not undone. So that's sort of the backdrop for this story. This in Jacobin, it's by Finlay Adamson. Biden is locking up thousands of immigrants in for-profit detention centers. So on top of the barbaric treatment of immigrants, he's also doing it at the behest of the rich. Who would have thought, right? When Joe Biden became president, he ended the contracting of prisons to private corporations with one glaring exception: ICE. Today, over 70% of immigrant detainees are being held in privately owned prisons. On January 26, less than a week into his term, President Joe Biden issued Executive Order 14006, directing the Department of Justice to end the contracting of prisons to private corporations. Now, of course, in a vacuum, that's a fantastic thing to do, but this is pointing out the one notable exception. While this was simply the reinstatement of an Obama-era policy rescinded by former President Donald Trump in 2017, the order represented a substantial improvement over the status quo and possibly signaled the Biden administration's willingness to address some of the most egregious elements of the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, this policy change permits one glaring exception. Immigration and Customs Enforcement may still contract private corporations to operate immigration detention centers. Private immigration prisons maintain some of the most disturbing and brutal conditions within the American prison system, including discrimination against LGBT inmates and widespread labor abuses. In October 2020, detention centers came under intensified scrutiny after individuals held at a private operated ICE prison in Georgia reported being forced into receiving hysterectomies. We covered this story. I'm sure a number of you remember this. Really egregious stuff. While prohibiting the private contracting of immigrant detention centers was a core plank of Biden's criminal justice platform during the 2020 election, the president has so far taken no action on this front. Biden's exception for private immigration prisons is deliberate, resulting from the uniquely, Jesus Christ, you guys, apologize. My brain just went glitched for a second. Uniquely privatized nature of immigration detention. While only 8% of today's general federal prison population is held in private prisons, 73% of immigrant detainees are incarcerated in corporate facilities. Eliminating private immigration prisons would eliminate the vast majority of immigration prisons nationwide, forcing the federal government to either shut down hundreds of facilities or operate them publicly. Multinational corporations such as GEO Group and CoreCivic form the backbone of American immigration detention, operating large-scale independent prisons and contracting with hundreds of local jails throughout the nation. ICE relies on the private sector to imprison over 500,000 undocumented immigrants per year. So again, you guys, it's like here we have sort of an intersection of reneged promises, one on immigration and one on the criminal justice system. So, once again, what Democrats do is less than the bare minimum, and then they demand credit. And then they're shocked when their poll numbers are down and when they get destroyed in the midterms. So this one, I think, is also particularly egregious as it pertains to the media, because we all remember under Trump, righteously, the media was hammering him for the images coming out at the border, children using tinfoil as blankets. You guys all remember this? Kids in cages was the way that it was described back then, as it should be described. And then as soon as Biden took office, what happened? Right? Nobody talk about that. Now it's detention centers, not kids in cages, right? And Biden here using that to continue to give handouts to these gigantic for-profit corporations as well. Also worth noting, we talk about Democrats' electoral incompetence. There's kind of a funny story here, which I think I have talked about before. I don't remember if I did it on the show or not, but the fact that Biden decided to give Kamala Harris immigration and the border was kind of like a backhanded move, because it's a virtually impossible issue to solve in a short-term sense. So you're basically saddling her with what is very likely to be negative PR, right? And it conveniently deflects some of the blame from you off to your VP, right? And then when Kamala doesn't do anything, then she's the one that takes the flack for it, which seems to fall in line with some of the reports that we've seen from behind closed doors about the relationship between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, which is comedically bad. And obviously Biden engaging in a demographic box checking exercise when he selected Kamala Harris. But just to be very clear, I think that part's in and of itself quite offensive, because there are a number of black women who are far more qualified to be vice president than Kamala Harris, and quite frankly would be far more talented in that role, both politically and in terms of actual policy and affecting change. So the idea that anyone like me who criticizes Kamala Harris is doing so because of her demographic, I'm sorry, if you're saying that all black women are just as untalented and just as corrupt and conservative as Kamala Harris, I think you're actually being quite offensive in that manner, right? So anyhow, a lot of angles to all of this, but Biden refusing to follow through on a number of promises he made about immigration, on a number of promises he made about the criminal justice system. And we covered earlier stuff about climate, stuff about Medicare, etc. It seems like virtually every major issue, Joe Biden has managed to go back on his promises and or make the situation worse. So just pretty outrageous stuff. I have a clip here I want to show you guys. This is a little bit long. This is Irami Osei-Frimpong. He's better known as the funky academic. He's a doctoral student at the University of Georgia. Irami has been kind enough to come on my show a couple of times. He is very thought-provoking. Everything he says makes me think a little bit deeper about issues, and I very much appreciate Irami for that. He went on Breaking Points to discuss the great replacement theory. I'm sure a number of you have heard about this, where Democrats essentially are relying on demographic changes in the country to bring about electoral wins, and conservatives are responding to this in pretty inflammatory ways, including the recent string of shootings, which has some relation to the great replacement theory, so to say. Irami gives his take on the social implications around that, and he also gives his take on the political environment more broadly and where we're heading. I thought this was a very interesting conversation, and guys, I tried to clip this. It's like 18 minutes, but there was no part that I wanted to take out. Okay, so this is a fantastic bit here from Irami Osei-Frimpong on Breaking Points, and you also can see Saagar is very much in disagreement with a lot of the things that Irami is saying, and that part kind of makes it a little more, I don't agree with Saagar on very many things, so it was kind of interesting to see the tone of this interaction as well. But Irami absolutely killing it as always. He does fantastic work. He's very insightful and very articulate, and I thought this was worth sharing with you guys. So Irami Osei-Frimpong on the replacement theory as well as our political environment more broadly.
Now to enlighten us with his latest wisdom is the funky academic himself, Irami Osei-Frimpong. Always great to see you, Irami.
Good to see you, man.
Thanks for inviting me on. So I'm going to go through 4 points.
Okay.
They're going to be very
What do we got?
short.
Go ahead.
And you're going to like a few of them, and you're going to really hate a lot of them. And
Good.
that's just how life is.
That's why we have you on, Irami. Hold on, before you jump into your 4 points, though, guys, go subscribe to Irami on YouTube, Funky Academic.
Yes.
Because, listen, like he just said, you may love some of what he says, you may hate some of what he says, but he is always going to make you think. Irami, go ahead.
Makes
what
me
you
laugh,
got?
too.
What you got for us?
Go ahead.
Well, so there's a theme in both the El Paso manifesto and this latest manifesto from the guy in Buffalo. And there's this idea that, like, they're trying to take our way of life. And the knee-jerk reaction is like, no, democratic politics is not trying to take your way of life. And I have to say, if you think that you get to pick up a gun and shoot people if your side doesn't win, and that's part of your way of life, I am definitely trying to take away your way of life. So, like, the idea, like, yes, I am trying to invade that quality of entitlement. And so we need to think of politics as invasive, but there are proper ways to invade and improper ways to invade. And there are a lot of cons and con artists who are out there making a job out of telling people that you can do good politics without being institutionally or personally invasive. And I'm saying we need to just be invasive in smarter ways and wiser ways. So there's this idea of the great replacement, this notion that non-political forces will change America's way of life by changing the content of the electorate. It has been a bipartisan political rhetoric for at least 20 years, except when Democrats say it, they smile and say, well, demographics is destiny. and that somehow magically, like, Democratic majorities will emerge based on a force of nature, not political will, skill, or risk, but just magically Democratic majorities will emerge, and that's fine. That's a form of lazy politics. And you can go ahead and put up the element that
Go ahead and put that on the screen, guys, please.
About.
Apparently we don't. We'll add it in post.
We'll add it in post.
Don't worry. Go ahead.
All right, that's good. So yeah, and that's pretty much there's a book that's just saying, like, don't worry about doing politics. Demographics will take care of you.
Yep.
And politics doesn't matter, as in, like, talking to people and convincing them about the role of government in their lives and what that means. And you have to understand that if you're a conservative who appreciates the American way of life as is, or at least who thinks it should be changed by political means, not merely demographic shifts, then you have to bring the guns out. Because this idea that demographics is destiny is they're telling you that politics doesn't matter. And so terrorism becomes the only way to keep your way of life and form of life. Now, that's ultimately—
Hold on, let me challenge you and make sure I understand what you're saying.
Right.
Because we do, in theory, live in, a country that has some responsiveness to the populace, some ability to make changes without resorting to arms and violence and guns and terrorism.
Right.
So why then if you want to maintain things the way that they are, why don't you do it the way that, frankly, the conservative business community has been very effective at, through their own sort of like big money organizing, direct lobbying of politicians? Why don't you do it through that way, which has also been extremely damaging but didn't involve direct violence, versus you saying, like, well, then your only option is terrorism?
Right. Well, so if the thesis that demographics is destiny is true, if that actually held up, then your only option is terror. But the problem that thesis doesn't hold up, because demographics don't make political people. American institutions do. And we need to understand that demographics isn't destiny, nor should it be.
Right.
And so, I mean, that's why.
So that means everybody's wrong, which is the lazy argument's wrong, and obviously the armed violence, I mean, that's always wrong. But yeah, go ahead.
Right. So yeah, the Democratic argument's lazy and wrong. But if it were right, then I could imagine, like, yeah, so we're not a political nation, we're a demographic nation, like, full of parochial ideologies. So violence is going to be the only way. But demographics isn't destiny, because people actually change their minds, and that's not how political visions are shaped, not through mere, kind of tribal loyalties in that way, in that obvious way. So demographics doesn't make Americans, institutions do. Like social and political institutions do. But institutions don't die like people do. So as long as the traditional control of cultural institutions holds, and antecedent property rights hold, and all of that stuff, it's not as if, like, the browning of America will lead to a political shift. We'll just get browner conservatives, right? Or we'll call them swarthy.
That's sort of what's happening right now.
Right.
But it makes sense. And I think it's a problem, but it's a political problem, and it's one that could be met through, like, political organizing and thinking through, like, in responsible ways, or more responsible ways than just the guns.
So how do we change that?
Funny you should ask, right? So we need to call that anti-politics. We need to just name that, this whole idea that demographics is destiny, that's anti-politics. And the panic that emerged out of that variety of anti-politics, the terrorist panic, that's also anti-politics, but just in an obvious way. But there are other forms of anti-politics, and we need to get rid of them all. Now, in one form of anti-politics, which, if you don't watch out, that YouTube might engage in, is this idea that we could have all of these very popular programs and these universal programs that are popular, but everybody believes in the program for different reasons and to different ends. And the result is that you have a coalition where nobody really can or should talk to each other about why they believe in what they believe in, because it's ultimately kind of vacuous, and the coalition can't stand scrutiny because it's not held together by any sort of, like, actual political holistic logic. And so you have a coalition of political enemies who, on some level, are kind of ignoring the fact that they're enemies. And there's a good example of this, a few examples of this, but one is, I think, the UBI. right? You can say, well, UBI is very popular. Both the leftists think it'll democratize power, and the landlords love it, and the tech oligarchs love it. But they don't like it for the same reason. The landlords and the tech oligarchs like it because they don't think it'll democratize power. They think it'll fatten up the lambs that then allow them to extract resources. So each side is betting on the other side, ultimately being too stupid to understand what the policy means. And so that's why these kind of coalitions around very superficial but universal popular programs that seem to be universally popular aren't particularly strong.
Can't the programs themselves, though, change the institutions and the cultural values? So, for example, with universal healthcare, obviously you have people like me on the left who just say healthcare should be a human right. Everyone should have access to it. No ifs, ands, or buts. You might also have, and I saw Brianna talking about this recently, you might also have a case the business community, which is very logical, which says, listen, if you're a small business, taking healthcare off the table makes it a lot easier for you to compete with larger businesses because now you don't have to worry about competing with this benefits package, which is very difficult and onerous if you're a small business versus if you're a gigantic corporation. So they may support it for a different reason. And that, let's say, in my fantasy world, that ends up getting universal healthcare through. Doesn't that then fundamentally invest the American people in the idea that, in fact, everyone does deserve these basic human rights and that that's a sort of bedrock foundation of society in the same way that, once we had Social Security, there was kind of an inevitability to, even though it was more narrowly, basically didn't help a lot of people to start with, it continues to expand to more completely encompass the American populace because we buy into this idea that old people shouldn't be starving and dying in their senior years.
So the business community is going to come back and say there might be a problem when we give everyone health care, but we have a hard time getting employees because now they don't have to work for us because of the benefits. So it's going to be qualified. It's going to be universal health care, but qualified. And you're betting against the business community being able to do that, right? So the business community is betting, well, this will be good for our business because we'll be able to we'll be able to hire more people and it'll be cheaper to hire them and it'll be good for our business. But as soon as it turns bad for our business, we can turn it off. We can turn off the spigot. And you're betting that they won't be able to turn off the spigot. And they're betting that they will be able to turn off the spigot. And so this is one of those cases where both people have mutually exclusive visions about what this good means, and they're betting on each other being wrong and who's going to ultimately control the consequences of it.
Yeah, but ultimately, at least you got universal health care and you're in a stronger position to continue to fight for it.
Right. And yeah, so we just can't talk about how I think that the business community is actually wrong about its ability to massage it to hold over employees' head. So that's how these coalitions are held together, and that might be a problem. But there's a contrasting case. For example, the stock ban, congressional stock trading. Mm-hmm. Everyone who believes that congressional stock trading should not be a thing pretty much believes it for the same reason. It's a relatively small potatoes issue, but at least there's kind of a real political unity to what's going on.
Yeah.
And so we have to take that seriously and see that as the virtue of actual doing really politics, where people actually believe not just in the top level good, but the reason that the good should be supported. And so you could actually build a strong coalition around that could sustain some scrutiny. All right. So 2 points right there. So what the anti-politics of depending on demographic or superficial university policy takes us from is the project of actually thinking through the conditions of democratic self-governance, right? So if just going after what's popular or just going after or just assuming that demographics will do the work for you as a substitute for actually doing politics allows you to not actually think about what we need to do politics, as in what kind of access do congressional candidates need to actually vie for office, right? So it's going to be kind of institutionally invasive from the top down, insofar as if we're serious about having a democracy or some sort of representative governance structure, politicians need to have access to the people. I know you ran for Congress a few years ago. It would have been a lot easier had you had some sort of guaranteed media time and also attention, right? So if we're serious about self-government more than we're serious about other aspects of our society, then we need to prioritize what it takes to get candidates in front of people and add each other in front of people. And it's going to feel invasive, both for the political candidates in a way, but also for the people who now have to, not watch their favorite show because it's going to be interrupted by a local commission debate, commission candidate debate, right? So we need to be comfortable with that quality of invasiveness for the sake of self-governance.
Okay,
right? So
I'm good with that one.
You're good with that one? All right, so this is the one that's a little bit, I got to prepare your audience for it because you're not going to be so good with this one. So also, if you're serious about realizing the politics of self-governance, you have to consider how social institutions uphold political projects. Right? So we like to think of politics as something you do, and then your family is something you do over here, and then your job is something you do over here, and then your school is something you do over here, and your media is something you do over there. And you could add them all together to get who you are, in the same way you could add kind of grains of sand, and all of a sudden you get a beach. But that's not how this works. And that's not, rather, in each one of these acts and in each one of these activities, the whole of you is realized. And that means that each activity itself has to cohere with the other activity, right? So you need matching jobs and churches and family life and media. They can't be just things that are distinct from each other. They have to cohere if you're going to have a sense of yourself. So instead of thinking of these different activities like grains of sands or even organs in the body, where they mutually support each other but are ultimately different from each other, you have to think of like family, society, politics, and media as different forms of a triangle, where one of them's equilateral, the other one's isosceles, the other one's scalene, but they're all whole triangles, right? Okay. And they have to like make sense as different forms of the same kind of thing. And this is important when we talk about issues like, say, pro-choice and pro-life, right? There's this idea that we could fix the choice discourse by just passing laws. But that's not the problem with the political problem with choice politics right now is the Catholic Church. Not just the Catholic Church, but a lot of Protestants and just any sort of religious identity that sees that as the priority of their faith, right? So that's the ultimate political problem with choice legislation. We have to figure out a way to massage the Catholic Church or the evangelical church in a way that supports choice politics. And you could do that because, Sotomayor is a Catholic, so there are different ways to be Catholic, and you can't just banish churches for a few reasons. You shouldn't just banish churches. But we do have to be honest about there's some ways of doing faith that are inconsistent with democratic principles.
And what do you think? What do you think is the way that change happens within a church?
Well, you need to you go after the seminaries. You got to go after the reproduction mechanism, right? So it can't come from outside necessarily, but you could start. You have to start seeding the seminaries. The right gets all of this, which is very frustrating. You start seeding the seminaries with liberation theology. I think in a well-ordered world, every DSA chapter in every locality should also seed a liberation theology church. Because, there's Liberation Islam, there's Liberation Judaism. So you should also see the Liberation Theology Church and also come up with an equivalent of focus on the family about what we do with nuclear families from a left perspective and how should the government support them and not support them and how do we support them as a political project. Because you need social institutions that uphold your political project. Right. So, and once again, the GOP kind of knows this, where they don't have to really get out the vote as a political project. What they have is social institutions, and then the votes will kind of bubble up from those social institutions, and they take the social institutions seriously. The liberals don't believe in social institutions, and that's a problem. But I think you also see how this works out in American history in terms of the doctrine of discovery, right? So the doctrine of discovery it started out Catholic, but it kind of went around. And it pretty much said that you could discover any land that's not inhabited by Christians, right? So It's okay to take over land that's not inhabited by Christians. And so what that ends up doing is legitimizing all forms of political terrorism. And then it ends up in Supreme Court documents, right? So there are 1823. There's the verdicts and judicial opinions that quote and rely on the doctrine of discovery as like a way of being, right? And in order to get rid of that, if you're actually going to go at colonialism, you have to actually investigate and transform like any sort of doctrine that's built on the doctrine of discovery, and that so that you can acknowledge that the claims of non-Christians to their land and their way of life are actually legitimate. Because as long as they're delegitimized in the church, they can be delegitimized politically, because it all has to cohere as the realization of a whole person.
Irami, unfortunately, we're out of time, man. But I know you're going to have more videos on your channel. Always something to think about.
So Irami has so much to say about absolutely everything that it's become a running joke on Breaking Point that they have to put a time limit on him. Brilliant stuff, you guys. Really brilliant stuff. And I know he jumps all over the place and he goes on tangents and things like that, but he's always very sort of thought-provoking to me. And what Irami always ends up doing, like, I think I'm looking at something in a big picture sense, and then I hear Irami talk about it for a few minutes, and I'm like, oh my God, he's like 10,000 feet up above me looking at a bigger picture sense, right? So he ties, it's the Democrats would love to just say, we'll do gun policy and that will solve this, okay? Now, I'm not saying there aren't merits to some responsible gun reforms. I'm not a hardliner on this one way or the other, and I don't know very much about that issue, to be totally honest with you guys, which is why I don't talk about it a whole lot. But I am far from I'm much more moderate on guns than most leftists. I'll put it that way. Okay, but we can sit and discuss the merits of various forms of gun reform to help to address or start to address some of the issues that allow for these mass shootings. Okay, Irami's pointing out sort of the roots, though, of the motivation. Okay. Now, it's obviously, I want to get this out of the way, it's obviously very cheap when the GOP or Republicans try to invoke, mental health as a response to gun reform, because, well, there's really a number of reasons. First of all, it's not an answer to the gun reform. It's a deflection. So it's not actually addressing the issues raised by those who support gun reform. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, does the GOP support putting resources into helping people with mental health issues? No, they oppose it. They fight against it. So it's laughable for them to invoke that as some sort of answer, as though, no, you got to vote for the conservatives who support the NRA because of mental health issues that are causing this, while we also gut mental health care. It's wildly hypocritical. It's an incoherent argument that they try to make. So just to set that aside, I'm not making that argument at all. But Irami, I think, is trying to get to some of the big picture societal roots of this problem. And he's saying, listen, here are the ways. It's not reasonable that these people feel backed into a corner because they're wrong about their great replacement theory. And he got that out of the way quick. But let's actually be realistic about what's causing the incentives here. And let's look at that deep societal level. He's basically saying, if you actually buy into the thesis of the great replacement theory, it's pretty natural that you would resort to terrorism. Because if you buy into the very thesis you're buying into says your political power is vanishing and there's nothing you can do about it. If you truly believe that, you're going to take action in other ways, right? So it's an interesting parallel to me to the left responding to the Democrats by basically saying you're a worthless and useless institution, which they largely are, by saying we're going to go march in the streets, we're going to do direct action, we're going to do strikes, we're going to try to unionize, right? We're going to build community and do mutual aid, and we're going to fight for things that way. We're going to follow what the civil rights movement did. We're going to take that path because we recognize that we don't have and won't have political power if we just keep doing what we're doing. The left takes that approach, and it's a similar recognition of a lack of political power. On the right, they've long held, in the whole history of this country, they've held political power. Straight, white, Christian men have held power in this country for its entire existence. So if they truly believe the thesis of the great replacement theory, then their power is going away and there's nothing they can do about it. Not politically anyway. There's no political avenue that they can take to change that. If you really believe that, that would motivate this kind of behavior. So again, you guys, that's not at all excusing terrorism at all. It's trying to get to the roots of the actual causes so that we can solve them, right? But the liberals just want to take the shallow, superficial, we'll just do gun reform approach. For a number of reasons. First of all, they know it's unlikely to happen, at least in any substantial way. So it's something they can say they stand for without actually having to do anything, and the public will largely believe them. That's one reason, right? So it's a PR boon. It's one of these issues where they can make these strong statements and appeal to, in sort of disgusting and disingenuous ways, appeal to the emotions of the voter, right? Look at the dead kids. We would have done something about the dead kids. Okay. Now, anyone paying attention knows they won't, because they currently are in power and they don't. But it's a sort of a cheap, convenient narrative for the Democrats to latch onto. So that's one reason. But the second reason is, if they were to actually dive into the stuff that Irami is talking about, their entire political strategy would fall in shambles, because they are relying on the demographics is destiny line that Democrats have now been saying for a decade plus, probably longer, but I remember it for at least a decade plus. And that's incorrect, you guys. We saw this with Trump. Okay, the Hispanic voters, and especially black men, were actually voted in higher numbers for Trump after his first term than before it. So this idea that demographics is destiny is a very flawed, position to take from the jump. But again, if you buy into it, it could explain some of this behavior, right? That was the first thing I thought was very interesting that Irami brought forth in that discussion. The other things were, I thought it was great that he connected all of our social and political institutions and economic institutions and legal institutions. He says, no, these are all part of the same thing. I really, really like that. We can't separate and parse these things out because they all impact each other. And I like that triangle metaphor. He says, like, they're all points on a triangle. So the triangle might be shaped drastically differently for each person based upon how they view these institutions or how they interact with these social institutions. But they're all triangles, and they're all complete triangles, and they all have to interact with each other, right? Instead of viewing it as, like, I think we often like to separate. How many times do you see someone say, well, I'm socially progressive, but I'm fiscally conservative? It's totally incoherent, you guys. It's totally incoherent, right? But we try to sort of like put these things into silos and parse them out separately as though they don't interact with each other. So your ideology, your worldview boils down to your views on all of these institutions together, and your view on power as a whole, and your political view, meaning how much power do you think workers should have versus owners should have, that kind of thing. Those views all compile to create your ideology. And what you are is your interaction with all of these institutions totaling up, not separately and like he said, we're not grains of sand on a beach here that we're talking about. It's one thing that is affected by all of this. I really thought that was an excellent metaphor. And he went on about the Catholic Church, which, believe me, you don't want to get me started on the Catholic Church, because I will talk your ear off for hours and hours and hours about the destruction that the Catholic Church has caused to humanity. The negative impact that the Catholic Church has had on human relations. But I like that he ties in the religion stuff there to not just the anti-choice position that people take because of religion. And I have to, now that I said that. For those who don't know, there is a bit in the Bible where a man is instructed to give his wife bitter waters because he suspects her of cheating, okay? And she's pregnant. So God basically says, paraphrasing here, but give her bitter water. If the child is yours, the child will be born. If it's not, it won't be. So what did God do? He prescribed an abortion. Okay. So if you're anti-choice on religious grounds, you're ignoring your own book. That's the first point. Okay. But the second point is what Irami was getting to, which is these positions are rooted in religion, not in something that can be neatly separated from religion. Like we think of politics as being neatly separated into different silos from religion, and economics and legal institutions. We think of these things as separate. They all interact with each other. And he points out that on an even deeper level, religion is kind of the root of colonizing, like colonial mentality is really rooted in religion. So anyway, I thought it was, whatever you think of religion, whether you're religious or not, I think it's very interesting to analyze and discuss the ways in which religion interacts with these other social and political and legal institutions, right? And we all should recognize that there are a myriad of factors that determine what kind of results we get when we interact with those institutions, right? Obviously, your economic status is one of those. If you're wealthy, you're going to get better results from institutions than if you're poor. Your race is one of those, right? Your gender is one of those. All of those things. But there's all these different factors that sort of compile to create a result. And it's difficult to neatly separate all of those things out. Just as on the next level, it's difficult to neatly parse out the results we get from each institution separately, because all of it compiles to be what we are and what our worldview is. Okay. Anyway, I could go on and on and on, but great stuff there from Irami. And by the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that he's completely right about the UBI. There's a reason the technocrats support the UBI, and I thought he put it very succinctly. He says basically they view it as fattening the lambs that they get to then extract resources from. Spot on. Spot on. That's what a UBI would do. That's why we at Real Progressive support a federal job guarantee instead of a UBI. Obviously, some basic income programs are very useful and can be a very useful tool at various times. I'm not at all opposed to using basic income when it is responsible and necessary. And I'm also not at all opposed to having a very robust social safety net that includes basic income for those on disability or those between work or these kinds of things. So the details are important there, but in general, a UBI, a truly universal permanent basic income, would not only be to fatten the pockets of the technocrats and the landlords and the oligarchs, but it would also very likely create true inflation, not like what we're seeing right now, which is this very complex mixture of price gouging and supply chain issues and things of that nature, and geopolitics and things of that nature. But true inflation would be created by a truly universal permanent basic income, which is why we support the job guarantee instead. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. Irami is spot on. And it's very interesting to look at, as he was, the what is holding these coalitions together. When you have landlords and you have minimum wage workers both supporting the same policy, that's interesting. and Irami is basically making the claim that that is not a coalition that can stand up through time, because at some point those two groups will separate in terms of what they want. The results they're getting from that policy will be different at some point, right? It's a very interesting point, and I think it speaks to why many of us on the left talk about class politics. I think that creates, we can build on similarities there in a way that is much more difficult to dismantle than those kinds of coalitions that Irami was describing, but like behind a UBI, right? So anyway, they got into all sorts of stuff in that discussion, but I couldn't find a part I didn't want to bring you guys. I think Irami is fantastic. I'll once again encourage you all to follow him on Twitter. It's at IramiOF, and he is the Funky Academic on YouTube. He's always making me think harder about these issues, and I encourage you all to follow his work if you are not already. So we got a story here. This is once again in The Lever. This is about how New York Democrats basically gave a handout to private equity. Again, encourage you all to follow The Lever if you aren't already. They do fantastic reporting. This again is Matthew Cunningham Cook, and this article is also by Andrew Perez. New York Dems' giant gift to private equity. New York Democrats just voted to invest a lot more pension money in private equity deals that rarely pay off. New York's Democratic-controlled legislature this week passed a bill to funnel as much as $54 billion more in retiree savings into high-risk Wall Street investments amid a flood of campaign cash from the financial industry. It's incredible how those two things are often tied together, isn't it? New York's largest teachers union backed the legislation, even though the move came after federal regulators and the union's own national leaders issued loud warnings about the risk of such investments. The legislation now headed to Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul's desk would allow officials to invest up to 35% of New York's $545 billion in state and local pension funds, in hedge funds, private equity, real estate, and other so-called alternative investments. The state currently caps pension funds outlays in alternative investments at 25%. Over the past 30 years, public pension funds have moved $1.4 trillion of retiree savings into such risky and costly alternative investments, creating mega firms that aggressively extract profits from businesses and load them up with debt while delivering middling returns to pension fund investors. While New York's alternative investment bill was hailed by proponents as a way to maximize public pension funds' returns, the effort could ultimately cost state and local public pension systems billions because private equity investments charge high fees but often fail to deliver market-beating returns. Either way, private equity firms could rake in more than $1 billion annually in additional fees thanks to the legislation. Not hard to figure this one out, right? They take a bunch of campaign cash, and what happens? They do what those donors wanted. And as they point out, there are $1 billion a year in fees to private equity firms and hedge fund managers. And this is one of those things, you guys. The market is like, look at what's happening right now. How far down is the stock market right now? That's what you could be doing with retirees' money, and what is happening right now with retirees' money. So it's obviously a give and take, because some people then benefit from pulling out their retirement at the right time when the market's high. But if you pull your deferred comp out at the wrong time, then you end up getting screwed by the market. And it's not the kind of thing that I think should be impacted by market factors in that manner. People plan out their retirements years or decades in advance, you guys, based upon, here's the window that I'm expecting to be making this annually. I'm expecting to have this much in savings. Here's what I'm expecting from healthcare. Here's what I'm expecting from Social Security. Here's etc. Right? People plan this all out well in advance. And if all of a sudden your deferred comp takes a 25% hit because the market tanks, that has a drastic impact on your retirement. I don't think that people's retirement should be left to this kind of volatile market as we currently do. And as they said, I think it's currently 25% of retirement funds can be put into those alternative investments, and they wanted to raise it to 30-something. That is, to me, irresponsible. It's also, to me, brazen corruption, and yet it is hardly surprising. Pattern in New York, you guys, they're obviously considered one of the bluest states in the country, so to say, and yet their legislature, which is always strongly Democratic, behaves more conservatively than most Democratic legislatures in the country. They had I'm blanking on the name right now, but they had this under Cuomo. There was this like coalition of Democrats and Republicans that basically worked together to switch the way that the procedure worked in terms of majorities. It basically like handed Republicans a lot more power procedurally to obstruct what Democrats were doing, and Democrats willfully went along with this. So it's just it sort of proves the whole one of the major sort of principles that we on the left hold about power in this country, which is that the Democrats essentially are gatekeepers for the conservatives. This is a great demonstration of that, how New York's legislature and state government has conducted itself for decades, right? That one of the bluest states in the country could behave so conservatively, could be so corrupt, all of that stuff. That really kind of makes our case for us, doesn't it? So private equity money comes in, and all of a sudden they're making another $1 billion plus in annual fees because of political decisions made by Democrats. Again, hardly surprising, you guys. Again, great coverage from The Lever. If you're not following their work, they are one of the few outfits in today's media environment that I think is consistently on top of things. So I know it's a bit of an abbreviated show today, you guys. I have not been keeping up on the news the last month like I usually do, so I apologize. We will be back to a full show next week, hopefully with interviews and all of that stuff. I like to do 3 or 4 hours every Sunday, so we'll be back to that kind of timeline next week. Once again, just want to plug realprogressives.org. Go to our website for all of our fantastic content, from podcasts. Macro and Cheese with our founder and CEO Steve Grumbine drops every Saturday. The Up and Up with Jody Newell on Thursdays, talking to activists. We have all sorts of articles coming out pretty consistently. Go check those out at realprogressives.org, and go to realprogressives.org/donate if you'd like to help us out. We are a nonprofit. We're a 501c3 and a 501c4, and we very much appreciate any and all help that you can provide. And I also, once again, want to plug the M for All Trivia Night. Again, that link is in the description box if you'd like to purchase tickets. It's June 8th at 8 p.m. It's trivia about Medicare for All to help raise funds for the march this coming July 30th. Again, want to encourage everybody, if you're in the DC area, to get to that March July 30th. There's going to be a week of action leading up to that march as well. And even if you're not in the area, I am in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm going to try to get to DC for that. Would love to see as many of you there as possible. Get involved if you're interested at m4mforall.org. And please do go to that trivia night if you are so inclined. The link again for tickets in the description box. With that, I will call it a show, you guys. Apologies again for my absence. Looking forward to being back to doing this regularly every week. I very much appreciate all of your support. And I will see you next Sunday at the regular time, 5 Eastern, 2 Pacific. I hope everybody has a fantastic week.